how you feel is much more important than how you think you should feel or how somebody else tells you they think that you should feel. Learning to listen to that and decipher the sometimes quite confusing and sometimes contradictory information we get from our body is really, really important. Welcome to this week's Thoughtful Thursday. And for this week's Thoughtful Thursday, I wanted to build on something that was covered in Therapeutic Tuesday in the session with Alex. I wanted to get into a bit more about why your body knows best, why it is so important to listen to the body in either our recovery healing journey from chronic illness, and also just generally, the body is a source of wisdom and information. When we're dealing with conditions like chronic fatigue, ME, fibromyalgia, there are so many different sources of opinions and data. There's kind of medical opinions, there are test results, there are things we read in books, there are friends and family's opinions, there's our own thoughts, our own kind of judgments. There's also our own feelings, our own emotions, our own body's experience. And what we tend to do is we tend to make other people's opinions more important than our own, particularly if they're medical experts. In fact, I was chatting to one of the groups doing the 90-day program, which is an in-person course we do here at Optimum Health Clinic last week. And one of them was saying that they were sent to on a specialist course on chronic fatigue. And they were told that they would get better by pushing their boundaries and challenging themselves to do more activity. And that made them significantly worse. And I think, from a point they were gradually getting better to the point of having a severe crash. There's lots of reasons why we tend to value other people's opinions more than our own. Partly just if it's medical advice, partly it can sometimes be also self-esteem issues. As a practitioner, I place an enormous amount of value on the data that comes from somebody's own body. One of the first questions I always ask new patients I work with is, how does it feel to be in your body? Explain to me how your body feels, both physically, in terms of your nervous system, in terms of your emotions. It's something that I ask people all the time in sessions as well, because I think it is an enormously valuable source of data. And actually, when it comes to things like activity levels, when it comes to things like pacing, how you feel is much more important than how you think you should feel or how somebody else tells you they think that you should feel. Learning to listen to that and decipher the sometimes quite confusing and sometimes contradictory information we get from our body is really, really important. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of pacing, at least in the way that's traditionally done. I'm a big fan of people learning to get a baseline and do what we call bouncing the boundaries. And we have a whole kind of set of teaching about that. But when we're pacing to someone else's plan, or a plan of a plan of what we think we should be doing, if we're not listening to our body, we are still effectively in danger of, we might be underdoing it, but more likely overdoing it and pushing ourselves. So, and for many people, their pushing and achiever patterns is part of the reason they got sick in the first place. We rarely solve a problem at the level we created it. If we got sick by pushing, we're not going to get better by pushing. We have to learn to listen and decipher what our body is trying to tell us. And it really is a language that we have to learn. And our body will communicate with us in different ways. And there's everything from how we feel physically, different types of tiredness. That's something that we break down in the Optimum Health Clinic approach. To things like blood sugar levels, what it feels like to be hungry, to have low blood sugar, what it feels like to be tired and wired. One of the things that can be very confusing sometimes is when we're going into a crash, we can get wired because the adrenals, the nervous system try to compensate. But actually when we're coming out of a crash, we also get wired, because energy comes back and that energy can go into the nervous system. So there are subtle differences in how those two states can feel, but learning to understand that can be really important. In this session with Alex on Tuesday, we were talking about the afternoon nap and kind of listening to what his body was telling him. And I should say in an email that he sent me after that, it had significantly helped, and it had stopped that mini crash point that was happening. So it had a significantly positive impact in listening worked, basically. Sometimes we can have multiple communications happening at the same time. So it might be, we look at types of tiredness, we might be physically tired, but actually, emotionally, we want the uplift of going to do something. And that can be a contradiction sometimes. Or we can feel kind of wired and we kind of want to kind of expend energy, but actually another part is like we're tired and we need to rest. And often we learn to decipher these communications by getting it wrong. That's the painful truth of this. As experienced practitioners, we get good at helping people decipher these different things. And one of the things that I think you'll see me doing in Therapeutic Tuesdays is helping people decipher their own body's communications of where they are, what stage they're at, what they need, what they don't need. But we also we have to learn to be doing that on our recovery journey. That's what you need to learn, of how to respond to all of this different data and all this different information. You do that by practicing. You do that by inquiring. You do that by kind of trial and error and decoding, in a sense of going, well, this happened that time before, and I remember I responded that way. It didn't work. Let's try something different this time. And not in a kind of obsessive way where you're constantly thinking about your symptoms and worrying about that can also be a problem. But being really curious and really listening. And for some people, it can be really helpful to keep a diary, a symptom diary, and track and note that when I did this at that time, that happened. And we gradually learn. We learn the language of our body. It's like if you don't speak Japanese and you go and learn Japanese, you'll be rubbish at it to start with. But the more you practice, the better you'll get. The body is always communicating to us. There's always data and information. And the more we're in our head, so the more that our mind is kind of stimulated, the less we're in touch with that data. And the more we're putting a layer of logic and ideas and thinking on top of that data. So we have to learn to really tune in, to listen. And a lot of the stuff that I talk about calming the nervous system, coming out of the mind into the body, will help you get more data and information. Sometimes we're trying to listen to our body and there's nothing to hear because we're not close enough to it. So we have to slow everything down, get more in touch. But often what's helpful at this point, there's so many tangents we could go here, but often the helpful point to make is going back to the start of what I was saying. There is a very important set of data and information that's always coming from your body. You have to listen to it, you have to learn to decode it, to decipher it, and you have to value it. And value it more than what everyone else is telling you. Sometimes medical experts can see things that we can't, and they're backed up by the right data, and we need to listen to that. Other times, they know very little about your experience, and they have strong opinions, but it doesn't necessarily make them right. And if they're saying you just need to push yourself, and you know that doesn't work, and your body's saying you need to rest, listen to your body. If friends and family are saying, you'll just feel better if you go and do this, and you think it's going to cause you to crash because that's the data, that's what your body tells you, you have to listen to that as well. Do bear in mind though, and this is something that's come up a little bit in these videos, the Tuesday videos, and it will come up, I think, more. Sometimes the communications is the part of what makes this puzzle complicated. Sometimes the communications from the body can also be confused. So if you remember in the first Therapeutic Tuesday with Lucy, and she was starting to come back to do some activities, and she was getting maladaptive stress response. And I was talking about neuroception, which is part of polyvagal theory, which I'll also talk about in future videos. She... in a sense, her body was telling her that something is dangerous when it isn't. And you have to learn to also communicate the other way. So you're listening to your body, but sometimes you're also having to reassure your body. And that's also its own process. So this whole piece really around our relationship to our body, The relationship has gone wrong because we've often, not everyone, but for many people, they've abused their body in the years getting up to being ill through achiever patterns, helper patterns, anxiety patterns. Perhaps it's trauma, perhaps it's just too much pushing for too long. We have to repair the relationship. And again, that's something I'm sure I'll cover in other videos. But part of how we do that is by tuning in, by listening, and starting to honor and value what our body is telling us. I hope that has been useful. This is a really big topic, and there's a lot more to be said about it. But I think that's probably enough for this video. In tomorrow's Flourishing Fridays are primarily aimed at practitioners, but I think that the content again this week will be useful for everyone. I'm going to talk about how to switch off as a practitioner. One of the things that I notice can happen is practitioners can get overly consumed by their clinical work and they start taking on the burden and responsibility and they don't let it go, and that can cause burnout in practitioners. And it's something that I pay a lot of attention to with the practitioner teams here at the Optimum Health Clinic. So I want to share some of that wisdom in tomorrow's video. Thanks for watching and listening.